Welcome to Funders on Fundraising. I'm Jeff McDougall, and I've been raising money for mission-driven work for over 30 years and rethinking what real power looks like in our sector.
And I'm Kelly James with Education First Consulting. I've been a program officer, a philanthropic strategist, and someone trying to make grant-making more human, direct, and transparent.
This podcast is a candid conversation about how money really moves and how we can build authentic, effective relationships between funders and fundraisers. We're co-produced by Chris Lawrence and Andrew Calloway and Decca Hussein Wetzel of Urbanist Media.
Today's guest is Elizabeth Eagen, a former grantmaker at Open Society Foundations, with a background in human rights, digital infrastructure, and field building.
We talk about what happens when you try to build something new inside a big institution, what it means to fund operations and experiments at the same time, and how to show up with clarity in a space full of noise.
It's a thoughtful conversation with some sharp observations and a lot of honesty about what works, what doesn't, and where the cracks in the system really are. Let's get into it.
I come from a teacher and a lawyer, so I was probably expected to be one of those things.
Yep.
Or a musician, maybe. But no, I think that the life's work here comes a lot from how my family has operated in the world. We've always been politically engaged. We've always been engaged in acts of service. And, you know, growing up, a thing that was really important to us around the dinner table or when we were engaged in family conversation was, what are you going to do to make the world better? So I think to me, the work that I did at OSF and the work that I'm doing now is directed by that. I'm really interested in merging things that make me intellectually curious with things that have effect on the world around me. So it's kind of a mixture of both.
Was it a foregone conclusion then that you'd be on this path, or did you entertain others, or?
I started out in human rights, actually. So I started out learning Russian, and I was really interested in the literature and in the music. And then that sort of drew me in more deeply to colonial theory and rights and justice, international law. And then I started at Human Rights Watch right out of college. Which was pretty formative because there it was both from the research aspect of like, what is Human Rights Watch working at in early 2000s, but also the operations of large organizations that are dealing with a mixture of hardcore evidence and rights argumentation at the beginning of a lot of civil society adaptation and adoption of technology. And the curiosity that sparked in me about how does an organization like that get the job done and also incorporate or ingest or collaborate with new technologies is just this forever puzzle. I think that's not something we've ever solved, but it is something that will continue to evolve.
One of the things we talk about in the workshop and on this podcast is how understanding program officers, especially ones like yourself, for whom it was the profession, it's not sort of, family money, those kinds of things, that these folks they're in the same band, they're on the same team. This is also their life's work, right? They're not othered from the experience. And so I was curious, when you moved from working at Human Rights Watch into OSF, was there a cultural clash? Did you learn things in a hard way? Or more specifically, did you choose to be on the funding side of the coin because you saw opportunities to advance your work that weren't possible when you were within the org? Like, what was the impetus there to pursue a career in funding?
Yeah. So in between was a couple of years in the Republic of Georgia, where I was on a Fulbright and studying and learning a lot about organizations on that side of things. So I was doing sort of a research project at the same time that I volunteered with some such amazing civil society organizations in Georgia, like environmental organizations there have just this like very keen focus on community, locality, beauty and like data. That's my favorite kind of climate change and ecology organizations all had this combination of like, this is natural beauty. And at the same time, access to resources and access to information are all key there. So there was a little bit of time in between working at Human Rights Watch and going into funding. And then, after Georgia, I went to grad school for policy. I didn't come out of policy school expecting to be on the funding side. I came into that sort of last terminal part of a policy degree, which doesn't last very long, thinking that I wanted to be somewhere effective, where the work that I was doing was going to have this kind of direct effect on the people who are the focus of policy. So I knew I kind of didn't want to do very like the long track in State Department. I wanted to be sort of in a more hands-on way. But at that point, it was more opportunity. So the job for funding felt like a natural outgrowth of learning the budgeting and the management and the sort of program managing side of what you get in policy school. And when it came down to being able to support rights institutions with keeping the lights on and turning projects into money, that seemed like a really natural fit. I think to me, I've always been pretty passionate about the operations side of organizations and how are they as places of employment, how are they as places of like building a life.
Did that affect your grant making?
Yeah, I think it really did. I mean, I started in a program that was specifically designed for that. So the Human Rights and
Okay.
Governance program, which was a couple generations back in OSF's Hungary office, had as its kind of core mission keep the lights on for the transparency and human rights movements in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia and Mongolia. So the focus there was really like, what does this organization need to operationalize and succeed? If you're a program officer, you're bringing to the table all of these skills, experiences, and opportunities that you've had in your past. And one thing that was really important to me when I was at Human Rights Watch and then seeing these organizations operate in Georgia was like, what is the thing that prevents you from going to, from being the best possible like output that you can be, right? If you're going to go do some advocacy in Brussels or Washington, D.C., what's keeping you back? But also, if you have this opportunity to capitalize on a piece of technology or a new kind of information organization, what organizationally stops you? What financially stops you? And what, for lack of a better word, like theoretically stops you? What are the barriers of how the institution speaks on behalf of itself that might prevent or stop you from taking on a new opportunity? And that all comes from this sort of snowball of experience. So at Human Rights Watch, I was an entry level person, right? That's the 2-year up and out position that I love a lot at Human Rights Watch, the associate job. But while I was there, I got this opportunity to do a campaign on the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Romania. And we decided to inject some humor, I guess, into these pretty serious topics. And so we ended up making a tourist map. And I got to project manage this idea to build a tourist map that showed Uzbekistan, Tashkent. And on one side, you'd have information that people who were going to go to the EBRD meeting would get about Tashkent, like tourist information. And on the other hand, like a demonstrably, like this is how close you are to sites of rights violations and sites of lapses in the rule of law. And so it was, we did it in Flash, like managing all of those things. And it was interesting to watch both the process of spending money that Human Rights Watch would naturally be considering was between, like, am I hiring another lawyer? Am I hiring more researchers? Or am I spending this money on these documents that need to be good looking, but also need to have accurate data? I inherited a huge database that I had to sort of dig through and like match names in different alphabets. And it just like the puzzles of all of those teeny tiny pieces stacked on top of each other gave me this picture of the inner workings of a rights organization, of any civil society organization, are far more complex than the budget that they give you will show. Because the last piece of that is that we had to sort of develop this project and then run it through Human Rights Watch's own interior analysis, program management. Can this be a publication that we push out into the world? And how does that change our public profile? And all of those kinds of decision makings were a much greater group of people than just one person. That to me feels like the point at which I kind of saw, okay, there's a lot more to organizations that needs attention, and then carrying that forward into these larger projects was key.
Yeah. I feel like I'm seeing a movement in some philanthropy to really, think about co-design, also attention, like how does philanthropy co-design solutions with community, and how do we center the questions of community in the way we operate in philanthropy?
When I was at OSF, we started to ask more questions about each program. Kind of had a lot of independence about how they would intake grants, the shapes of the grants that they tried to make, and so on. So coming out of the first program that I was a part of, which was the Human Rights and Governance program, that was big grants to keep the lights on. And I sort of built a program between that and the information program, which is where we house much more of our emerging technology. That's where I started and kind of built from the ground up the Human Rights Data Initiative and the Emerging Technologies program. And the way that I was able to do that was to play in between the spaces between keeping the lights on and experimentation. So organizations, as they experiment, have to be able to take risks. They have to be able to assess those risks and sort of make bets on whether pursuing the line of inquiry is going to change things. And grant makers have to support that. So one of the things that we were able to do was have this discussion with all the people in the information program about how we might talk about the upside and downside of risk, and how we would talk about what we might be thinking were the right questions to ask, and then how we would feel that inquiry with organizations and groups that were really important to us, with groups that we had a sort of longer term field relationship with, and then how we would extend that into more experimentation. And so what really changed for me, what clicked a light for me, I guess, is when I kind of came to my grant making philosophy. So I have one. You have to have one. I don't think you can escape having one.
Your individual one for yourself.
Yeah, within your institution. And then, every grant maker is an individual working for a boss. The boss is working for a strategy. The strategy is determined by boards and larger philanthropies. Especially in a large, complicated one. So making your grant making philosophy fit with and be legible to people within the institution is really key. So this was mine. I wanted about half the money in my budget to go to core. There were people, I was building a movement. There were people at the start of that movement who were field leaders who were pushing the values, the ethics, and the experimentation at like a very appropriate pace. They were doing what they were good at that I probably wouldn't have been good at if I were a funder kind of pursuing my own pet plan. They were extending the reach and they were extending their collaboration into geography and into space and diversity. And that core funding would let them make the case that emerging technologies' place in rights and accountability could and should look like this. About 30% of my money I wanted to dedicate to experimentation within that kind of core operations. So even when you're giving core funds to someone or you're giving, a solid chunk of their annual budget, the 30% says, okay, now that you know how you do this part of the practice, what's your extension? How do you bring this to other people? How do you partner with others so that you and they learn together and make the changes that you want to see in the world? And what kind of risk do you want to take for a shorter term? And that could be with an organization I had an existing partnership with, or in the job I was in at OSF, I would have that pot of money available to other people who weren't in a technology-centered program, so that they could say, my organization already gets core funding. What can essentially it's project funding on top of core.
I would love to jump in here. You're mentioning the core and the project funding.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
One of the frequent calls I get when someone calls me up is they say, I got a lot of project funding. I want to switch to core funding. And my piece of advice that I always give is I really encourage them to kill that entire construct with fire. The money's for the work, right? And if you're selling into the funder correctly, the money isn't for chairs and secretaries and travel. The money is to we need to launch the pilot, we need to scale it across a campaign, and we need to formalize it through a training program. It's the money's dedicated. And if you're selling into what you'd want to do and it gets restricted, it's kind of immaterial. And also, if you did get unrestricted funding, it's not truly unrestricted because if OSF gave me a grant, I couldn't go open a McDonald's franchise. It's even if it's not legally restricted, it's still ethically restricted, right? So, and I noticed you're using those terms. I was just curious.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think that that's a really crucial way to think about your own budget, but you have to understand how the programs work inside different foundations. And at that time, it's probably different now, but at that time, the distinction between project and core was really important, right? It would matter about how much paper you had to file. It matters how you write. It matters how that grant gets processed within the existing grant making database that they're using. Being able to speak that kind of language can be both this is how much paperwork I will have to submit to you. This is the level of contact you will have. And that determines how often the grant maker expects reporting. But it also helps you help the grant maker divide their portfolio into big and small experiments and big and small stages of building. So by the time I got to this grant making philosophy, 50, 30, and now I owe you 20, which is 20 is the moonshot, 20 is the experiment, 20 is me giving 20% of my fund to say okay, what does data escrow mean for civil society organizations? What is the concept of a data trust and how does that change all of our assumptions about the financialization of data that people have created in individual group experiments, et cetera. By the time I had that philosophy, I was planning a mixture of 3-year grant making. So having some organizations that will consistently just be performing their core strategy, they're kind of your anchors of your portfolio. And then other, like the 30, the 30% of the money is helping you build alliances within your own institution and with other funders to shape fields that are emerging. And then 20% is exploratory for idea. You're looking at a mixture across like 3 years, 3-year funding cycles. It's not that everybody gets 3 years of money. It's that you as a grant maker understand that you are saying, okay, I am keeping this movement alive. I'm expecting linear progress from some of these grantees. I'm expecting this to be a catalyst. I'm expecting exponential growth. Like it gives you a vocabulary to talk about your expectations. And so there's advantages to understanding those. Right. And one more point on this, by the way, is that I know it's out of fashion, but I did have some grantees come back and say, hey, listen, I need project funding because project funding protects me from the like core budgeting thesis of my large organization or small organization. Project funding keeps me on track with you to do the experiment rather than mix it in. It's not always the case. Like that is sort of an organization is going through a change kind of conversation, but it does exist.
In one of the exec jobs I held back in the day, it was a perpetual thorn in my side, one of these projects that never conformed to our strategic planning. It was like something we wanted to kill, but they kept going and raising their own money and then trying to use the fact they'd raised their own money as an excuse to keep the program going. Right,
And
it was
that's not what I would want that to be, but I totally get you. There's also a generational dialogue, and that's my main point here, is that especially in the fields that I work in, the generational dialogue between sending, like, if you're going to send me out into the wilds of country X and I don't have a company cell phone, how does my security change? And how can this institution understand and support that? That experience of working for an organization in hazard and in change, I don't want to throw any more young people on the front lines. In that instance, I would want them to be able to say, okay, we have guidance from Elizabeth, who has been an expert in witnessing how digital transformations of organizations can go right or wrong. And she says she won't give us this money unless we have these other pieces that she has experienced are necessary to do this kind of project. That kind of dialogue is an intervention that grant makers can do to save lives. And I'm not kidding. Like I will say the best small grant I ever made was to research the effects of secondary trauma on journalists and humanitarian aid workers and human rights workers. And what did it mean that we all went through these periods of time where young people's job was to sit with a pair of earphones on and watch bad things happen over and over and over again? And what would that mean if we knew what that meant, and if we talked through it with some of the experts in the field, like the Dart Center that works on victims of torture, like this body of practice, and we compare that with this experience of people coming into their own via new technology, we would understand something really profound about how we all experience emerging technologies, threats, and benefits at the same time. And that has to be done with very targeted funding that is delimited and protected.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to just pull back. I think, Jeffrey, the question that you asked elicited, Elizabeth, like two things that came out maybe about your grant making practice. One, I think this like sense of relational trust in a grantee coming to you and explaining what they needed from you. I think the second, though, that came out was maybe a sophistication. I think, Jeffrey, in talking about like program or project funding, and maybe a required sophistication of grantees to know how to maneuver that. And I'm curious, in your role, when you were sitting kind of in the funding seat, did they have that sophistication? Did you help build it? Like, what was your role in helping them manipulate, maneuver how to get kind of the right funds, from you or colleagues?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. It's really important for the grant maker to have in mind, what is the shape of the grant that I'm giving and what is my intent with that grant? And being an intentional grant maker requires you to say, okay, I think you will be best served by this kind of grant that is this length of time that has these parameters. There are instances, for example, where like more regular reporting would time a grantee so that they were showing up with a report that I could forward around before a key meeting with other people who might be considering their budgets. There would be times at which like having a grantee on deck to come and talk to the board meeting would be a critical moment for them to like have a product in place that they were coming and sharing with people. I think there's also like in the end, it is the grant maker's responsibility to move the grant through the processes. And on this side of the table, as a grantee, I do have a lot of grant makers who are having these conversations about the shape of the grant they want to give to us. That is really like, it carries a lot of significance for how they operate in their own foundation. And it has relationships to our grant making that are complex and wouldn't be worked out without that kind of care and talent and dedication on the side of the grant maker.
Is that hard for you on the grantee side now? It sounds like a little bit like the foundation's shaping it a little bit more, but you feel comfortable in the way that they're making the match or approaching you.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the earlier question about what is the real difference between project and program and core funding, right? Like the shape of the program, that negotiated space where the project, the shape of the funding and its significance or its indicators within different bureaucratic systems or different organizational systems has it, as long as there's this sort of open meaning between all of the parties, it really can be a good thing. I don't see the downside to letting the operators within a foundation and the operators in civil society have pretty rich conversations about what the shape of the grant means to either party. But I do take your point that some of those conversations might require a level of sophistication that isn't available if you've never been a grant maker. Like you can get grant makers who make these pretty naive grants that end up harming grantees. And I feel like in my 15 years of service in philanthropy, I was able to kind of head some of those off at the pass. Like, don't give a 6-month grant for somebody to build a piece of software. Don't give grants to give people software. Is another conversation. But like, don't give this as a six. Why are you giving this as a 6-month? But we also were able, like, there's work that the grant makers have to do to make that transaction work. The grant maker has to be able to understand, especially in my world, this was really important, hiring and money in a way that isn't necessarily top of mind for most grant makers, right? To be able to understand, like, I I know you want to diversify your pool of people creating things with your technology. It makes sense for you to be registered in the Netherlands or registered in the United States, but you want to work in the whole globe. So we have to have a conversation about how you diversify bodies of power in your organization and whether you are truly dynamic and understanding like this can't just be a global north, global south divide. That's really a crucial part of understanding and taking on the organizational infrastructure of any grantee that you're working with. But there's another side to it, which is understanding that just because someone doesn't live in a northern Western country doesn't mean that they can't have a salary that is equitable, right? Like that geography can't be determinate. That geography can't say like, oh, if I suddenly picked up and moved to another zip code, I would be able to make more money as a salary. There's all kinds of ways in which as you do this kind of global grant making work, you uncover these assumptions, right? Like, oh, well, it's probably cheaper to live in Nairobi. Like I would know, you know what I mean? And so being able to unpack and uncover those and remove them from your grant making scrutiny is really critical.
One of the things that's becoming very apparent in listening to you, how you sort of thought about these things, you were very strategic in your approach, methodical. You paid attention to the details that a lot of people ignore. But you also have mentioned a few times how it's important for there to be candor in these relationships and in these conversations.
Mm.
That's something that's really central to this podcast and the conversations we have is what does that exchange look like? And it can be broken in both directions. Your job as a funder is to fuck off and give me a check and disappear is broken towards the civil society. And what's broken towards the funder is come and audition for me and I will decide whether or not you are worthy of my attention and to be a part of my strategy. And I'm wondering if you might engage in a bit of self-reflection. When did you feel like you were leaning too far one way or the other back towards like, this is my strategy, my money, my decision versus, no, this is a shared process? And how did you manage your own power in that dynamic?
That happened earlier in my career, way earlier, where I did feel like a check writer and I kind of had a confrontation about it in a way with the sort of, it was a sort of traveling circus of a lot of things going on. But I had to have a conversation where I was like, look, you are not on this trip because it's fun. We're on this trip to do work. And I'm not here just to write a check. I'm here to accomplish some things. I don't know if that was an over exercise of power, but what I did take away from it was I don't want to be in unclear power dynamics with people if I can help it, right? So there's a couple of ways that I think that that resolves. One is paying attention to the slush pile. So there's like a general email that we used to get applications to, and I assigned and like staffed the uncovering of what was in that general operating email, general email. And there's a lot of funders that do this really well, where they don't, it's not like if you send it to, mail@funder.com, you're not going to get any response. You will get a response. So that was really key to me, is that having other people on deck, especially at the entry level, especially in emerging, like learning this as part of their career, to be taking another look at things that I was maybe missing. I think the other piece was, again, this 50-30-20 strategy that I had, where 50% of the funding would be going to people who didn't give a shit if I liked them or not. Like, they would tell me, you are screwing up. You need to do this. You need to know and see and have these other things. And I did end up funding some folks from that. And I ended up paying attention to some of the core community problems that came up, that harassment within the community, or, dynamics that were going on with other partner grant makers or other things like that.
Those people that, didn't care, like, why? Because I think a lot of grant seekers don't feel empowered like that.
I think maybe not caring is probably the wrong way to put it. What I would call it is people who are really good at self-advocacy. There's a way of saying, oh, you don't want to be caught in the backbiting between civil society organizations where they go and they talk to a funder and they try to ruin it for each other. That's not what I'm talking about. And that type of thing is very easy to sort out when you're a funder. No, these are folks who have a demonstrated presence, and their organization is healthy. Their staff isn't afraid of them. They are moving through the world with a vision and a clarity to what they're doing, right? And you can see that over time as you develop relationships with people, and it often comes through core grant making. And then you deliberately seek out and offer that kind of listening. You say, I understand this power dynamic. We're never going to get out of it. It's always going to be there. I'm always going to be your check writer, and you will always have to impress me. But at the same time, I hope you can trust me if you need to talk to me about something, or what do you think of this, or how is this, and it's a human exchange that basically is I understand we are all operating in these very tense situations, but it's never going to go away.
Yeah, we're touching on something really core to the work, which is this construct of human interaction, authenticity, right? Centering the work as opposed to centering your org, your needs, or those types of things. And it's really core to what we're doing.
Yeah.
One of my pet peeves is, just as a fundraiser, when I listen to civil society organizations talk about how they're not getting money because funders don't understand something, or they actively take their rejection as a sign that they're somehow correct and the rest of the world just doesn't understand, and they've got the moral weight behind them, right? And those things are clearly wrong and alienating. One of the jokes I make is the funder had this idea when they were in grad school, tried to do it 3 times on their own 10 years ago, have funded it 3 times since they got their job, and come into the conversation with you with a huge amount of learning and experience, and maybe even bias against your idea. And why wouldn't you want all of that information brought to bear? Why wouldn't you want to uncover that in the process? So when you're thinking about when you were challenged, what was the source of power, legitimacy, authenticity that the person wielded that made you feel like the challenge was meaningful and respectful? And maybe you can also talk about the times you were challenged and you felt that was just annoying or immature.
Okay, so you had said that sometimes it's that the grant maker knows what they're talking about, and that's why you didn't get the grant, right?
Yes.
And so there have been cases where that's true, but I think especially in an experimental field, being open to suggestive change is really key. And so I had a challenge where someone was talking, it's actually data escrow was a really big challenge for me. Someone came to me who I was in a different conversation with, and they said, have you seen this organization? They work on data escrow, and it's very important and it's really key. And I had to sort of take a couple steps back, because the data escrow that they were talking about was about victims of sexual violence. And so the idea is that data escrow allows you to put your information in a timestamped kind of lockbox, but then come back to it with parameters that say when it will be shared. And that felt very antithetical to how I had been operating as a sort of human rights researching person for a long period of time. And so the expertise that I was getting from this external source, and it wasn't the organization, it was someone else, was no, you really do need to take a look at it. And I was pretty repelled by it, but being able to sort of sit still and like say, okay, I need to read the paper. I need to read the data. You have sent me information and given me the time to consider and come back to it was actually incredibly valuable. And so I guess in that instance, the person with the expertise wasn't over pushing and saying, you must do this. They were saying, this is an aspect you have not considered. And I myself experienced it as a change. And I would like you to look at this change with me.
What was their form of authority is the wrong word, but their form of power? Like what were they acting on behalf of that made you pay attention? Was it?
Yeah, they were a human rights researcher with a legal side to their work. So they were coming from fields that were important to me that were talking about an extension of that field. And so to me, the most important piece here is standing, that you're talking to somebody who I was talking to someone who I had a prior relationship with and who had standing in 3/4 of the things that they were talking about and were extending, like, you need to look at this other piece of thing.
One of the things I'm getting at is we talk about, and I may be coloring the answer I want to get from you.
Is it how do you change a funder's mind?
It's part of that, but it's also like, what is an appropriate form of challenge, right? Because again, we're talking about the balance and recognizing that we're in it together. And what we're trying to do is by definition, really fucking hard and really fucking consequential, or else we'd all be investment bankers and having more fun, right? And so like from that point of view, well, fun is in quotes, depends what you're spending your money on.
They're not going to see my face.
From that point of view, one of the things we talk about is that we want folks to recognize that funders are there acting on behalf of a strategy, of an agenda, of an idea. Their job is not just to write a check into yours. They shouldn't like look for tools and chess pieces just to go do what they're told. It should be a discussion and a dialogue. It should be emergent from the partnership, from the collaboration.
Yeah.
But if the funder is asserting something that you don't want to do or disagree with, I don't want to do it that way. That's not how we work. My preference would to, these are all just sort of, they're kind of losing hands, right? But if you asserted from the point of view of what's best for the work, what your experience with the work has been, what would prejudice the work, what would advantage the work, those are more sort of postures that allow for that discussion not to be read as just you being pissy and not wanting to do something because you have an alternative preference. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you mentioned was someone, when they were challenging you, they are coming from a perspective of, we're actually missing a critical part of the work, as opposed to, I think you should be doing something else. And I was just curious if you had some discussions or just for fun of times where you were challenged in a way that was like, again, just either insulting or annoying or immature, and like how were they carrying themselves in that moment?
Oh, I don't know. I think I have like just a nice filter that's like, okay, well, this isn't the professional relationship that we're pursuing. What I want to pull out of what you're saying actually goes a little bit back to this community balance. I think, Kelly, that you were bringing up earlier, right? How does a grant maker who's supposed to be operating at this strategic level interact with communities and like the push and pull of groups that are committed to a certain kind of effort, right? They're committed to quality of human rights investigations. They're committed to ethical promulgation of technology. They're committed to certain principles that they're coming to you from, and they're applying for money to do more of. But they are also having these sort of internecine fights among themselves about credibility, about like behavior, about the work is really stressful. So people hurt each other all the time. And some people overstepped really important and legal boundaries and need to be dealt with in ways that aren't always clear in a place that is sort of like a lot of people working together who aren't under the same HR. It's just how I would put a lot of our community work that we do together when organizations partner or have large meetings or all those other kinds of things. And that is where I really needed the guidance of the large institution and the guidance of both my internal HR and the experience of the people who worked at OSF. And I will say every time I came to those folks with a question about how do I handle this particular like situation that has arisen, and I did a lot of grant making in the pre and post Me Too hashtags. It was really thoughtful and careful because, and this goes to your question, Jeffrey, philanthropy is a legal institution and it has vulnerabilities and risks. It has internal HR. It has people who want the health of this community outside to also be good. And so my colleague worked in the grant making support group that we had internal to the Open Society Foundations, and his perspective and his team was sort of dedicated to this kind of question, which is if you're a grant maker and you are feeling pressure from yourself as the holder of money, but you don't have the power to stop somebody's organization or like intervene when there's these power dynamics. Like, what do you do about it? And I found that kind of so there's sort of two places to adhere as a grant maker to your institution. And one of those is, this is our agreed upon strategy. I think your idea is really cool, but it doesn't adhere to our strategy. I can help you, but that is it. Everybody has a boss, right? And it's also, this idea that there are internal practices and support for those larger questions that come up that can actually fragment movements. So those are the two things that are important to me.
I just wanted to jump to a scenario again along these ideas and themes of authenticity and really, really focusing on the metadata of the relationship as opposed to the specifics. Like, you wake up on a Monday morning, you check your calendar for the week, and on Thursday you've got a meeting with the grantee and you have a sense of excitement and warmth and comfort and you're looking forward to that meeting. Why? Like, what is it about that relationship and how they're engaging with you that makes it one of your favorite things that week?
It is that I'm going to learn something and that I'm going to hear their enthusiasm for their organization. I'm going to hear a little bit about their problems that are sort of two levels. One are problems that are in the world, and two are problems that I can solve. I think grant makers want to solve problems. They want to help their grantees. They want to hear more from their grantees about the little things. And I think you'd be surprised by how many teeny tiny little like tweaks a grant maker has at their disposal to help you. So that kind of meeting is really enriching when it's not a litany of here's what we did on all these different days and all these sites, but it says, you invested in us, or we want you to invest in us. Those are your two meetings, right? You invested in us. We took your money. We did stuff with it. We showed other people. We created this thing. Here's 3 key insights that we want to bring back to you. 2 of them we're going to operationalize. One of them, we'd love your thoughts on how do we make that go further and deeper. What are you working on? And what's exciting you and what's interesting to you? And what kind of signals are you getting from philanthropy and from the funding world that we should know about? I mean, this is all sales work, but this is exactly that's the kind of ideal relationship you want with grantees, where you're professionals and you're like having this conversation about the work itself and the outcomes that are there. And then just to sort of tag a note in, grant makers, it varies by institution, but they have different things at their disposal, like executive coaching for organizations going through transition. Or my colleague works in an organization that was shut down and they were taken by the police. Like, what happens next? There's all kinds of big and small interventions that are available to your grant maker that you don't know about until you tell them what's going on. And I will say, the other thing that I really, really advise people is, if you have something going on in your organization, report it early, flag it early. Don't surprise your grant maker, because the way that meeting goes really poorly is if the surprise comes too late to do anything about it.
Yeah, we always talk about the difference between, hey, when we chatted on Thursday, we had an idea for 1, 2, 3. 3 is going to look more like a fish. I'll get back to you about that next Thursday, versus a year later. By the way, we didn't do 3, we did fish. Right? And the difference between those two scenarios and the reaction you're going to get from the funder. And so it's great to hear you speak of those things. Kelly, you sound like you had a question.
Now that you're out of the foundation world, what are some practices that maybe you might reflect on now, you would have done differently when you were sitting in that role? And so that, sounds like you've gotten both sides of the coin here. And, as a grant maker, like, what are some of the lessons that, you would have known earlier or engaged in your practice earlier to better support grantees?
Yeah. I think that if I had the chance and I could wave a magic wand and go back, there's sort of 2 big things I would do differently. One is, I think I would have told the folks in my portfolio my thinking about why it was the portfolio it was earlier, right? Like, I don't think a lot of them had this sense of why I had created this group of folks. So there are a couple of funders doing that now, where they spend a lot of time talking to their portfolio of grants. And that's been a recent thing that has emerged that I like a lot. So I think I would have done more on that. But to me, partly, I'm not excusing myself, but I think the emerging nature of what we were working on meant that I came a little later to this philosophy of grant making, or to this shape of grant making. And like, my thesis about it, I came to that in probably 2019, and 2020 was the year I was going to travel the world and implement it. So not to give myself a little bit of a COVID pass, but that's kind of, I would start earlier on that. I would have done two other things. I used to run a community of practice for other grant makers in the foundation, and I would bring my grantees or grantees who were kind of adjacent to my portfolio because it was so multi-stakeholder and sort of applicable. And I would have done more documentation of that. So I have a whole thesis in mind about like what it means to have grown up in this technology enhanced programmatic work in civil society and what that makes of all of us as employees. I think of us as what I'm calling axial knowledge holders. It means that you have this like set of skills you use on this one issue area, but the skills themselves are transitional to other issue areas, and we lose a lot when we don't remember that these sort of axial knowledge holders can be like a jar lid that fits on this jar of fireflies, but it also might fit on this jar of ketchup. Do you know what I mean? Like there's ways in which separating out and documenting in the community of practice the skill sets that transition between issue areas that's sort of a missing piece in philanthropy, because we tend to be much more siloed in thematic areas and geographies, and technology is a little bit more lateral, I would say. And then the final thing that I would probably do is I would have pushed harder for accompaniment to give people on the ground experience in policymaking. So you have all these documentation organizations or these civil society organizations that haven't been to Brussels yet. So when they want to do a campaign, they got to like go and just be mystified in Brussels or DC by like, what are all these backroom deals? What are all these things? Like, where do I go? Who do I meet? How do I do this? And that acquisition of experience isn't well mediated by anything but spending money on going to Brussels. And I think that we could have done a better job giving people just that kind of like, here's your feet wet in this particular spot. And that's something that academia does pretty well. Like you can go with your advisor to a conference and watch them work. And that's something that I also really enjoyed doing for other grant makers who were sort of emerging. I would take them to a conference where it was my home conference and they would see me work, and then they would develop their own personas of that conference work. So I would do more of that.
That's great. The last beat that we tend to sort of look at is this most tactical applied salesy beat, right? Like there's a author activist in our field who's one of the most charismatic, persuasive speakers. And the challenge is always that the last sentences, which is, well, we all need to unite and come together and understand our shared humanity. And I'm like, okay, sure. So is that tomorrow? Am I wearing flip-flops? Like, where am I standing? Like the actual specific on the ground tactics of sales. So when you think about how you were approached, we've got someone who's listening to this and they want to approach you. Let's pretend that you're back at OSF. They wanted to approach you. What are they doing? Is it at a conference? What are they saying? How are they coming to you? Is it an email? Or is it setting up a meeting? What's the first sentence out of their mouth? Like, what are they doing?
So at a conference, there is a way in which talking to people about the content of the conference is a way to discuss your work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I much prefer more clear, like we are definitely discussing funding conversations. I prefer clarity because it is a business transaction, because otherwise I don't know whether I should have another cocktail or not. But basically, there are ways in which conferences will do like a round robin with funders. And they can be really chaotic and it's like speed dating, but it's fine. I don't mind that. And I think it's the grant maker's obligation to determine whether they can be comfortable in that situation and comfortable being constantly approached, right? Because when you're a funder, you're walking through a conference, and if you're not going to be ready to be approached, don't go to the conference. I'm sorry, like deal with it, right? You don't get to whine about this opportunity that you represent to the world in a place where that quest is on.
One of the pieces I advise and that we always talk about is I'm really interested in how you're centering, in your words, the transaction. Because I talk about how the idea is to transcend and ignore the transaction, to be on the same team, same side of the table. And actually how having a meaningful, interesting, intellectually sparking, creative conversation is the way to engage someone, as opposed to this is what we're up to. I find sometimes if you center the transaction, it's more efficient, but it also means that you're being evaluated based upon criteria that's already established in the funder's mind, as opposed to having a chance to reshape that criteria. One of the things we talk about is how like death is being 7th out of 12 people waiting at the stage apron to talk to you after the panel. Like you don't want to be in that line. You want to be distinct from that line. You want to be separate. You want to be the person who they're looking forward to having the drink with. because it's fun and creatively inspiring, as opposed to this is my 30 seconds to impress you. And it sounds like you actually liked the 30 seconds to let me know what I'm.
No,
Okay.
no. I think when there's, it's not the panel, it's the if there's a speed dating opportunity, I think those
Got it.
can be really enriching. It gives you a better picture, at least of the field, and puts face to name and can be that kind of thing. And then that's establishing the opportunity to talk later. But I think that there is a way in which, what is it somebody said to me the other day? This whole idea of die before you go into battle, right? Like you don't want to, you're not trying to conform what you're selling to the funder's expectations. You're saying, this is who we are. Are you interested in this? Like, how do you work? What do you care about? Why are you at this conference? Who are you in this moment? My institution does this, that, and the other thing. I think probably you and I would approach this the same way. I think we maybe just have different vocabularies about it. It's really engaging people on like a mutual level of, these are the problems we see in the world. Do you see this problem? Is this something you're interested in? How can we, like, what does talking to you, if I'm the fundraiser and you're the grant maker, like what does talking to me give you and what do you give to me?
The idea of centering the work, centering the challenge, centering the creativity, asking questions, not just talking, finding common cause as opposed to just broadcasting.
Asking common questions is really crucial. That is the thing that, like, if somebody's just like zzz at you and they don't get to know you, then it's not ever going to be a connection.
Yeah. I think the other thing I hear, though, from you is a little bit of like sometimes philanthropy needing to, and again, I know it's not a monolith, but understanding that, let's just say program officers sometimes needing to lean into your role. Like people are talking to you about fundraising. And I loved your example because I participated in this kind of venture fund conference that very few funders came. And, after years and years where they were showing up and asked a few of them, why aren't you showing up anymore? Well, I didn't want to get, pitched. Everybody there was pitching me. And I was like, but
that's why you're there. Yeah, no, get it together, everybody. Like that's why you're there.
Places. And so I think there's this, there's both this, strand of authenticity, but also this like, sometimes you go do the speed dating because that's part of your job, right? Like that I'm hearing. And again, it might make you uncomfortable, but we also have to do things in our work that makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I think the focus can be on clarity. The grant maker approach that I appreciate the most is clarity of like giving an early yes, no, rather than stringing people along. But I also really liked being able to say that, okay, this isn't for me, but it might be for somebody else. Here's 3 suggestions for how you could improve this pitch that you're doing. And that's my way of saying, I can't give you what you want, but I'm giving you something that you might use in another scenario. And that was for me the best way to handle like sort of something that would be an immediate no. And there are things that you'll get pitched that actually honestly are truly heinous and really upset you, right? Like, I mean, I don't think we should tag people with their real name and real ID so that they can comment online. So don't pitch me that. It's a terrible idea. And I'll tell you so, right? Like, and I don't mind telling you so because I think if you don't hear it from a funder who has been capacitated with this power, then this whole thing falls apart.
I appreciate the focus on clarity, and part of that clarity, I think, is recognizing, to your point, that of course the conversation is about money. We always talk about how it's not, oh, I want your advice, because clearly the conversation is about cash. But also, if it's only about cash, it's dismissive, and you're a check writer. It has to be about many things, including cash, right? It can't just be about cash. You mentioned, like, let's get to the point. Can I help you or not? What do you clarity? And I'm not pushing back on that, but one of the things that's challenging as the fundraiser is that you never want to go first because you want to understand who it is that you're talking to, how they engage, how they think, what they're concerned about, so that you can instantly remix what you're doing on those terms. And so I know another funder at a big institution who takes it as a big source of pride that one of their very first things is tell me what you want. And they do it as an act of service, to your point of like, they don't use that sentence structure, but like, they're actually a very gracious person, right? But like from their point of view, they're being kind and respectful because they're trying to get to a no really quickly. And the challenge I've put back to them is that you're actually preventing the sales process from working by doing that. You're actually preventing the fundraiser from figuring out how to customize and tailor what they're talking about to your interests and finding that common cause by trying to push for the decision right away.
Yeah, I'd probably be more persuaded by what you are offering. I think it's going to depend on um, the level of the person you're talking to as well, right? But I agree. I think letting the pitch unfold and letting people talk has a lot to do with how we also support civil society to thrive. Like you might not be for me, but you might be for somebody else. And the more you give your pitch and the more you try, the better you do. Because fundraising is a really hard job. Like I'm doing it now. It's a very hard job. And there's so much weirdness to it. There's so much just like what you don't love the puppy dogs. How can you not love the puppy dogs? Like there's a lot of weird sort of cycles of guilt that go in and out of it. And then there can be a lot of sort of intellectual struggle when someone doesn't see things the same way that you do. And that is really frustrating for us as humans, but it has to be that disagreement and some pitches don't work. But I think letting people talk and try to shape their pitch is fine. And I prefer it because if I know what I'm doing as a grant maker, then I'm still going to know what I'm doing, even if you've said, no, but my thing is your thing. And like, no, it's not. And I know why. Because you're helping me improve. You're helping me stick to my theory of change and stick to my philosophy and my tactic. No, I'm not funding puppies in 2025, and I'll tell you the 6 reasons why. But I'm still not going to fund them, even if you give me a puppy.
And it's a continuum, right? Like I think there are ones that right off the bat, like this is just not a match, and then there's that shift. Like maybe there is one, and then there's the like, hey, foundation strategies change. Maybe in 2028 you will be funding puppies, so it's good that we know each other now, and keep in touch. But I do think there, sometimes that leaving that little opening when it's really not right doesn't work, right? And it becomes that waste of time because it's like, it's like a breakup, when you leave a little, maybe we'll get back together. We're probably not getting back together.
Yeah, and
right?
that's also a mark of maturity on the fundraiser's point of view is how they respond to that. If they recognize it as like, oh no, I still have hope to push this through versus, okay, we're taking a couple of steps back, but I'm still in dialogue. Let's go a little bit mid to long term. Let's restart. Let's start again, right? As opposed to, oh, I still have a chance to force this through.
Yes, it's the security of it. I think the best fundraisers are people who are secure in what they're doing. And it's like, I'm not a match for you, but am I a match for somebody you know? Probably, because funders know lots and lots of people. And I think that I probably could go back in my list of emails, my 10 bajillion emails. And there have been people who I'm like, I'm not your funder, but X might be. And then if I enjoy that conversation and if I learn something from that conversation, then I might give you a warm introduction. Hey, Joe, have you met this? Have you seen these people? They're not for my portfolio, but what if they are for yours? And that security of the fundraiser is like, that makes it much less uncomfortable if they are like, I know who I am. I'm not going to change the whole thing just for your portfolio, but you should be interested in my thing because I love it.
Yeah, the passion behind it, the creativity, the spark.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's been, sitting with me is that I do feel like this conversation around your work in philanthropy has a little bit of a different trend to it. And I was trying to figure out why. And I think, one of this is around some of the things that have remained true, like the authenticity in these relationships. I think the transparency is something that like continues to come up as really important. And then I think there's this like spectrum on how we think about authenticity of relationships. And I think what I'm pulling from you, just having, kind of met you through this podcast, is like actually like seeing through the politics or the personalities to like, maybe you show up more as like, if I can really understand the work, I don't care how charismatic or compelling or offensive this person is, if to a degree, if this work is really good and it's aligned to where we might be going. While I think a lot of times we tend towards the most charismatic or most compelling pitches. But can we also kind of put those shields aside and say, like, what does this work stand for? Does it move? Again, I think in your compilation of portfolio that you had, is just going to help build it towards this movement that I'm trying to create. And I just think that's a different, and you can say, Kelly, that's totally wrong. I'm a really sensitive person, and but I think it's a different way to engage authentically, and how we define and understand that in relationships that have this element of power. So I've really appreciated it from that perspective and pushing my own thinking. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both for doing this podcast. It's really cool.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thanks to Elizabeth Eagen for the insight, nuance, and honesty she brought to this conversation, and for helping us to see the work from both the inside and the outside.
If you want to go deeper into the ideas we explore here, fundraising, power, relationships, and strategy, you can find our workshop materials at aspirationtech.org/HTRM.
Funders on Fundraising is co-produced by Chris Lawrence, plus Decca Hussein Wetzel and Andrew Calloway of Urbanist Media. Editing and mixing also by Urbanist Media. It is hosted by me, Kelly James of Education First Consulting,
and me, Jeffrey McDougall of Aspiration. Our cover art is by Ben Johnson, and our theme music is by Evan Greer.
This podcast is a production of Aspiration.
This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The views shared here belong to the individuals, not their institutions.
To hear more episodes, find show notes, or get in touch, visit aspirationtech.org/podcast.